Oops. Right, good evening everybody and welcome, and thank you so much for coming out this evening for our event this evening. My name is Eddie Barnes. I'm the director of the John Smith Centre here at the University of Glasgow. For those of you who don't know, the John Smith Centre works here at the university to provide opportunities for young people to get involved in politics and public life, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. We've been here for 10 years and we do internships, research, education and events like this, which we hope inspire and encourage the young people in the audience to think about politics, think about public life in a positive way. We are absolutely delighted this evening to be welcoming two fantastic guests. This is the second time we've held this event, Surviving Politics, which is designed to bring people together from perhaps different kind of political backgrounds, different political persuasions, in having a bit of a conversation, having a debate about the issues of the time. Those of you who might have been here last year, the first year we had this event, we had Michael Gove and Humza Yousaf here, and about 7 police cars and 200 protesters outside. And I'm very sorry to say that we have no protesters and no police cars outside this evening, which in no way speaks to the interest of our two speakers this evening, which we're delighted to welcome some absolutely fantastic twosome this evening. So I'm going to welcome them to the stage. If you'd please give a big round of applause to Fraser Nelson and Kate Forbes.
Keep them clapping.
So let me just do a quick introduction, not that it's particularly necessary, to our two guests this evening. So first of all, Fraser. Fraser has been one of the most influential political journalists working in the UK for the last 15 years. He broke his journalistic cherry here at the University of Glasgow, where he was editor of the Glasgow University Guardian. And I think it's fair to say from that high point, it's been downhill ever since. He was a political reporter at the Times here in the Scottish Parliament, a political editor at the Scotsman, and then for most of his career, editor of The Spectator from 2009 to 2014. He's now a columnist writing in the coveted Saturday slot. I still think of it as the Matthew Parris slot. Sorry, Fraser.
Yeah, me too.
He was once described by John Cleese as a half-educated tenement Scot. Describes himself as a data geek, a rational optimist. Married to Linda, a Swede. He's a Europhile who backed Brexit, and a proud son of Nairn who opposes Scottish independence. On issues such as welfare reform and the direction of the centre-right, his voice has led public opinion. So Fraser, we're really delighted to welcome you back to your alma mater this evening. Thank you very much for coming. Kate Forbes was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2016. She's the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, the MSP for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy and Gaelic. And I think widely acknowledged across the political spectrum as one of the smartest and most talented politicians of her generation. You see, Kate, when you leave politics, this is what happens. People start being really nice to you.
I know, in the words of my mother, she would say, if that's what they say about you, it doesn't say much for the rest of them.
Kate is a supporter of our EU membership and Scottish independence, and she shot to national prominence in 2023 when she stood for leadership of the SNP following the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, where I think she found herself cast into a fierce debate about her faith and her religious beliefs. She stood in that campaign while still on maternity leave, I think I'm right in saying, following the birth of her daughter Naomi, and in the 3 years since, she's spoken candidly and bravely about the challenges of combining a cabinet job in Edinburgh, a constituency job in Dingwall, 4 hours away, and a beautiful toddler somewhere in between. The piloting legislation, facing the media huddle, negotiating budgets, she said, were merely preparing me for the greatest challenge, figuring out alternative childcare when the childminder calls in sick. As I said, Kate is sadly leaving Parliament in a couple of months' time, and has spoken in recent days about the conflict that all politicians, I think, feel between public duty and family life. And given all you have on your plate, Kate, we're absolutely delighted that you found time to come and join us this evening. So thank you again for coming. I'm going to start with you, and on that, obviously you are about to leave full-time politics in a couple of months when the Scottish Parliament elections are called. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of, as you're looking now towards the end, whether you have any kind of mixed feelings, and I guess what you're going to miss and what you're not going to miss.
So I think I'm meant to be here to inspire you all to go into politics, and so the question of how candid to be about how little I will miss is one that I'm dwelling on. But yes, I was just calculating in the car, which may tell you a thing or two. It's 7 weeks until my Scottish Parliament pass ceases to function. So 23:59, they've told me, on the 26th of March, I will no longer be welcome in the Scottish Parliament. And then, interestingly enough, I cease to be a minister when I'm replaced. So if it's a decisive election and a new government forms fast, I will be relieved and released. And if it isn't, then I may well see you again in a year's time. So that's my outlook right now. And, what will I miss? I think what I will miss is being able to get things done. And I think in politics, it feels at times like you're wading through treacle trying to do that. But if I've learned anything, it's that if you persevere and just fight at every hurdle, you can get things done that wouldn't have been completed had you not really pursued it. And so I think that is what I will miss. I came straight from a number of engagements today where I could think of things that have happened entirely because 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I decided that I was going to fight for it to be done, and it's been done. I think I'll miss that sense of achievement. I guess what I won't miss is that I can count those things on one hand. And there's a lot of things I've tried to get done. And just, if you look back in the last 10 years, just think of all that's happened politically. We've had constitutional change, we've had political instability at times, we've had geopolitical emergencies, to put it politely, and that's just in the last week alone. And so in the midst of all of that, and never mind COVID, cost of living, inflation, impact on public finances and so on, there's just been a lot on. And I think if you think of the electorate's bandwidth being extremely stretched to the point of breaking, which is the frustration I think so many people feel, then the same is true of politicians who actually only have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to try and get things done. So I think that would be my summary of what I'm not going to miss, and maybe a couple of things that I will miss.
But you have spoken about this you've been quite conflicted by it. A lot of your family was saying that I think your husband was saying, please carry on. And you yourself have said, you feel like you may be letting people down by going. So it's been, obviously, but it was a hard decision I'm taking.
Yeah, I thrive on difficult things. So I thrive on that sense of trying to beat the odds, of pursuing things that are not easy, and of fighting for things that are hard. So when it comes to walking away, that is actually really difficult if you characterize it as taking the easy option. Actually, for me, it was the harder of the two options. So staying and almost feeling like you were doing the dutiful thing and the difficult thing, and you were finding a way through all the balancing acts, and you could pat yourself on the back saying, this is impossible and I am conquering it. That was hard, but it gave me a real sense of identity, and it gave me an objective. What is much harder is to say that actually I am going to decide right now that it's impossible, and I don't want to keep doing the impossible. And I'm almost 36, birthday's on the 6th of April, if you want to know. Almost 36, I'd be 41 at the next election. And it was a really simple question. Over the next 5 years, what do you want to be able to point to as having achieved? Do you want that all to be characterized in political terms, in maybe status terms, in maybe professional terms? Or do you want to, have a bigger family? Do you want to have a wee 8-year-old by that point who is grounded and secure and happy, and she sees her mum more often than once a weekend? So there you go, what do you want? And I think when I put it like that over the 5-year period, it really crystallises, and then it becomes a question. You know, I was asked the question, are you proving that women can't have it all? I was saying, absolutely not. I'm proving that women can choose, and I'm making my choice, and I'm proud of that choice, and I am enormously relieved to have made the choice, because I was finding that it's harder to get into politics than getting out of politics. And that's my bottom line. I've had not a single moment, not even a creeping little question about making the right decision. I am absolutely rock solid convinced it's the right decision.
Last question. So your daughter will be 8 by the time of the next election. So given that we know how fun 8-year-olds are to be around, are you going to come back?
No, I don't. I think it's unlikely. I think I certainly don't have a heart to come back.
Okay.
It's not me sort of trying to play coy. I really don't have a heart to come back.
Fair enough. Fraser, you chose to be an observer rather than a participant, if you like, in politics. Yeah. Although, as we were just talking backstage, you know, editing a national magazine for 15 years brings with it its own stresses and strains. But you've been within kind of spitting distance of, you know, pretty much every main political leader in the UK over that time. I just was curious, you know, what you make of, you know, the standard of politicians, of the and what makes exceptional politicians and so on. You know, in your experience, and what kind of observations you've made over that period about the state of our politics.
Well, I guess I would kind of split my journalistic career into two. There is the first era began actually the day that John Smith died. I remember I was here at Glasgow University, and it was, you know, a big deal. This is a guy overwhelmingly expected to be the next Prime Minister. Died at a very young age, very unexpectedly. And even though I was just a student then here, it was still a big sort of wave of shock. And then after that, Tony Blair came along. And then the Blair era pretty much lasted for a long time. I include David Cameron in that. And you know, politics changed a little bit at the margin, but not really fundamentally. Now, this was in the post-Soviet era, where people assumed that there was going to be this new kind of, not quite the end of democracy, but a new kind of consensus. And we were all pretty much working domestically and internationally towards that consensus. Now, I would say that period also ended here in Scotland in 2014 in the referendum. Now, that was when I was editor of The Spectator then. And then you start to see things happening that you never thought you'd live to see. Now, I think Scotland came within a whisker of voting for independence then. I mean, it's now remembered as being a sort of, 45-55. But when you compare to where support was for independence before, I never thought I would live to see independence that close. Yeah. I think the Union came this close to being fractured because of lots of things that should, in theory, never have happened. Now, after that, everything else starts to happen, which you wouldn't expect. You get now, in terms of what makes a good politician, right? A great politician is somebody who can basically change the agenda, who can, I think politics isn't about governing well. I wish it was. If it was about governing well, we'd have a lot better governments. But politics is about making and winning arguments. It's about articulating a cause and winning people over to your cause and making them think that that is in some small way a battle worth fighting. Now, Alex Salmond did that incredibly well. And I remember thinking as a unionist, well, hopefully he'll go away and this nightmare will just disappear. But then along comes Nicola Sturgeon, who transforms from a kind of like joke Jimmy Cranky figure into like this new glamorous, articulate stateswoman on a sort of, again, it's sort of one of the most effective politicians that Britain has ever produced. So you get this double whammy of excellence in Scotland at a time where there wasn't happening in Westminster. Now, they changed the bit. Now, then you end up with the 2015 election. I remember the FT calculated a 0.2% chance the Tories would win that. And obviously everybody was wrong there. Now, even Cameron didn't think he'd win that. That's why he promised a referendum. So he was locked into doing this referendum, which he never in a million years thought he'd have to enact. And then he thought, okay, well, let's get it done early. And then again, against all the odds that went around. So you get these rupture after rupture after rupture. And they pretty much eventually get Donald Trump that year. And so then you get this world of a period where politics seems that it was absolutely like granite, as if it was running on these historical rails, to a period where these political entrepreneurs were able to enter the arena and change the weather. And now the most effective political entrepreneur of our days is Nigel Farage. He is the one who is, from a standing start, probably going to come second in the Scottish Parliament election, which is incredible when you think about he's barely got a staff here. So this kind of period of revolutions, if you like, just hasn't seemed to have stopped. So who knows where America's going to go? I mean, by the time the next... I was thinking the other day of what the 2029 G7 summit's going to look like. We could have probably, after Macron, will come Le Pen or Bardella, one of those two. So we can end up with Farage here. We could probably, not probably, there's a good chance of J.D. Vance in America, of a Le Pen or her understudy in France, perhaps AFD in Germany. So this period of huge historical change, which started, I think, with a referendum here in 2014, I think is continuing. And it's good politicians who make the weather for good or for ill. Now, I am not a fan of Nigel Farage's politics, but I cannot deny that he is out of nowhere managed to summon head in the polls. And he's doing that because he's a very good politician. He's a very good salesman. By his own definition, he says politics is about selling. He once actually said it's about selling fear as well as selling hope, you know? But that's what's going on. And if it's going to be countered, it needs just as good politicians to do that.
Right. The way we're going to run this evening, I should say, I was interested just to get opening reflections from the two. I'll ask a few questions to begin with, but I'm very keen that everybody has a chance to ask questions and to make points. So we will come to you after I've asked a few questions of Kate and Fraser. So please do start thinking about what you might want to ask. Let me, if I may, just stay with Fraser to ask you a little bit about, on the same theme that you've talked about now, and let's get straight into Trump and the kind of and Trump world. We had in a couple of weeks back in Davos, Mark Carney describing it, that we weren't just going through a kind of blip, this was a rupture in the way that the world has worked. Something similar to what you've just described, actually, that we've kind of gone through into a different era now, we're in a new era. So I'm wondering, the question really, and I'll put this to Kate as well afterwards, is, you know, are we going through something that is temporary, that will last only until Donald Trump finally shuffles off this mortal coil in 2.5, 3 years' time? Or is it, as Carney says, a completely changed world? We are now in a new world where we're going to have to rethink the way the world operates.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's going to go away with Trump. I think there's a very good book, actually, by this guy called Patrick Ruffini, who explained the Trump phenomenon before Trump came along, looking at these demographic shifts, looking at how the Democrats have become the country club party of the rich. And so this thing, it predated Trump, and in Vance you've got somebody willing to carry him on, and God knows how many MAGA figures. Now, whether they're going to stay in power is another thing, but I think that tradition is far bigger. In a way, Trump kind of conforms to the demand for that sort of politics. As far as I can work out, that demand is still there. But I don't think that the Carney speech in Davos, it was a wonderful speech, one of the best political speeches I've heard in a very long time. He spoke about Václav Havel, who was a Czech playwright turned president, the kind of things I was studying in what was the Institute of Soviet Studies here at Glasgow. It's probably changed its name now. But that speech also was completely wrong, I think, sadly, because there is no realistic rupture. When you look at it, America is far bigger than Trump. Here's the good news, that Trump may pretend that he's like a mad king controlling America, but he's not. He is constrained by a constitutional republic. The Supreme Court's probably going to knock down his tariffs. He had to drop this Greenland madness after public opinion rebelled against him in the polls and in the markets. He's just a major setback in Texas. He's probably going to lose control of the House later on this year. America as a country is a far better ally than Trump as a person. And I think when you're talking about your long-term alliances, really what's the competition? I mean, a communist autocracy of China or the greatest democracy in the world? Now, I've got so many concerns about Trump and the way he carries his business, but I think where Carney was not right was to suggest there is an alternative. Now, these middle powers Sure, we can trade more with each other. I'm all for free trade, but we don't have a nuclear deterrent in the way that America does. So for as long as we are entirely dependent, and Europe is, we have run down our defence, we've got no alternative but to cleave to America for defence. And until such times as we've got the means of defending our continent independently, we are going to be part of the US-led bloc on whatever terms America wants. Now, in my view, Europe should give itself more options by increasing defence, but for long as that is not going to change. And when it also comes to trade, whether it's Scotland or whether it's Britain or Europe, America is easily the number one trading partner. And again, that's simply because there's so many Americans who are doing so well. So we are going to be connected by trade, by tradition, by democracy to America. So you know, I'm as angry about Trump almost as Carney. If you're Canadian, you've got a special reason to be angry with Trump. But I don't think there's going to be a new world order.
Kate, what's your view? And also, what do you think, as a government minister, how do governments here in the UK, the Scottish government, UK government, how should they approach this this challenge?
Yeah. So I think there's two things going on, and I think what's happening in the UK is very different to what's happening in America. I think there's quite a few that will draw parallels between Farage and Trump, and I can see where they're going with that. But I think there's something much deeper that's going on, which I do think is a fundamental shift, particularly to our politics, which will have an impact on world order matters. So I think Fraser talked about, it was fascinating listening to Fraser, but he talked about the way in which Farage has sort of come out of nowhere and is currently polling. Every poll that we have seen in the last few months has Reform consistently in second place in Scotland, which I don't think any of us would have believed this time last year. Never mind the fact that he is consistently in the lead for the next UK Parliament. Now, where has that come from? Well, politicians only become that successful in polling terms when they are starting to build a following. Where does that following come from? And I think what has happened in the last few years are instructive and fascinating for any political leader, which is the way in which the public, the population, the electorate have shifted in their priorities. And I read a really interesting piece on the popularity or lack thereof of Farage as a political leader, which was most people saying, we don't like him for, this is in Scotland, for all these different reasons, and then it's followed up, but at least he's saying X, Y, or Z. I take that and I combine that with a lot of the feedback I get, particularly from younger voters, and there's a lot of fascinating pieces that are being written by younger voters as well, which is what they crave right now is authenticity and truth. So our politics, you know, and a lot of this can be faked by politicians. You know, they can fake authenticity, and you see that from some political leaders, I would argue. But what they are looking for is a bit of clarity at a time of huge, tumultuous change. So we have got the economic impact. GDP figures out today or yesterday, November, 3 months to November in Scotland. What was GDP growth? 0.3%. But we get very excited because you know what the UK GDP growth figures were? 0.1%. Right? What is that offering to this generation and the next generation in terms of career, job prospects, and more than anything else, at a time where inflation, okay, is slightly more under control than it was a couple of years ago, but we're still dealing with the consequences of that cumulative impact of inflation, getting way less than you used to for what you're earning. So you've got that economic instability, you've got the political instability that I don't need to tell you about, you've got the social and emotional and psychological instability of a generation that's come through COVID. So I think you combine all of that and you get an electorate that is looking for something. And what they are looking for is authenticity and truth. And the risk is that they'll find that in politicians that, you know, may lead us to less than attractive places and may not actually be able to solve it in the long term. Now that I think is a bit different from Trump and the MAGA movement and all the rest of it. But if you look at what Trump's doing in terms of that fourth dimension of global instability, I was in the United Arab Emirates last week until Friday, And on Friday, I wasn't sure that with the American Armada in the Gulf, whether there'd be enough airspace to get out. When I left Scotland, the risk was Greenland. In the middle of being there, the risk was China. You know, it's just one thing after another. And so I think my reading of that is that the sort of instability, now I'm talking at it very much from the position of the electorate right now, because voters choose the next political leader and will choose the next party in power and will choose the next policies. So I think there can be a tendency to think that Trump makes the weather or Farage makes the weather, and to an extent that's true, but ultimately it'll be voters. And they're not just informed and influenced by what they hear from people, they're also informed and influenced by their circumstances. And I think their circumstances are leading to very challenging choices because they are looking for a bit of solid ground, and there's not been much solid ground in the last 5 years.
You truth and authenticity, but and you also, to go back to those economic figures you mentioned, is it also not the case that the answer to populism is going to have to be some form of, sustainable economic growth that people actually start feeling, which is your job?
That is in a nutshell. It's going to be economic prosperity. It's going to be growth. It's going to be jobs being created. It's going to be well-paid jobs. And, we could talk a lot about where the opportunities are for that, but I think that requires a bit of realism and where the opportunities are.
Fraser, is there something you wanted to add on this?
You're right about saying people when polled, they don't, even Trump voters will say that he's unfit for office. Now that is quite often because they see him as a necessary corrective to an establishment that they don't like. It's a really important thing to understand. The same was true for Farage. A lot of people might think, no, I don't think this guy is fit to become Prime Minister, but I want to upset this apple cart. So in a way, that's why we're choosing them. And then and also Kate's point about authenticity. I think also it's, I think Kate proved that in her own leadership contest. I remember when Kate did it, and she was asked the religion question. Now, I'm a Catholic, and I've always been very shy about mentioning that. And Kate answered it straight on, and I thought, oh my God, this is a suicide mission for Kate. She's going to go down as a sort of, because Christians, you're going to have a sort of crucifixion complex, I'm going to go down for Jesus sort of thing, I thought this is going to be the end. But against all odds, Kate managed to come very, very close to winning that in a machine, with an SNP competition that was very, very rigged behind the establishment candidate, showing that authenticity works. Even if people don't show you values, they're proud to see you standing up for what you believe in. And I think there is a hunger for that kind of thing now. And almost anything, you want to see real people with real beliefs. And I think, so Scotland gave a very interesting clue there. And hopefully it will be emboldening other politicians who think, okay, if I say X, that might go badly amongst the opinion groups, poll groups, but if I argue for what I believe in, people will see that. So I think we do want to return away from the kind of automaton politicians towards people whose characters you can at least understand, even if you don't agree with all of it.
Okay, let's probe not agreeing and talk about a couple of issues that the two of you disagree about. And I mentioned them in my introduction: Europe and independence. In fact, I'll focus specifically on the case for independence because we are, 2 months away from a Scottish election. It looks like the SNP are in the lead, potentially within reach of a majority. I don't know whether you think that's the case, Kate, or not, but it's certainly looking not far off. But let me ask the same question to the two of you on this issue of independence and why you think your opponent is wrong, but also what you think are the strongest arguments that each of you have for independence and for the union, and what your weakest arguments are. So let me come to you, Kate, first, Kate.
Okay. So Fraser's strongest argument, I think, is familiarity and being one big happy family, because everybody likes being in a big happy family, and it's a familiar context, it's a familiar scenario. I think my strongest argument, and I'm talking about principles here rather than anything else, is about potential. So it's about what can Scotland do with more powers. Now, I have always been of the view that if you can demonstrate conclusively that there is a path there to, for example, greater prosperity, I hear that argument a lot. I'm neutral on the Constitution, but I will support the side that can prove to me that that 0.3 figure for GDP growth becomes the 2.3 figure, which is more in line with comparable small European countries. So for me, that's the disconnect between the two areas. Under that, there's lots of other arguments that people will deploy. So as part of one big happy family in terms of shared history, shared past since 2014, is that at the time there was an argument between a fairly safe and familiar status quo and change. And I think few could have envisaged the extent of change in the last 10 years. There's been a lot of change, whether that's constitutional in terms of our relationship with Europe, or it's other changes in terms of, again, just using a global pandemic that did upend the society as we knew it at the time. So I think things have fundamentally changed. But that, for me, is a central sort of two arguing points. And in terms of potential, I think the bottom line, and obviously this is where you will want more answers to flesh it out, is that if other small countries without the same advantages as Scotland has can be so successful, there's no inherent reason why we can't be, but nothing is inevitable. So change doesn't guarantee prosperity. It requires you to be very intentional and focused about the policy decisions that you would make to back greater prosperity for your country, which you can do if you have, for example, more of the various different economic, for example, levers. And so I think that would be my, there are very strong arguments on both sides, and ultimately comes down to which is the route that will deliver greater prosperity or greater security or greater cause for optimism for an individual voter.
Does there come a point, I mean, as somebody that's already, on the way to almost leaving politics now, where you could imagine yourself sitting back and say, actually, I'd like to rethink this, and maybe, could you, or is being in politics now so kind of, you just get so embedded in your beliefs that it's impossible to imagine changing your mind on something
No,
like
I
this?
certainly think politics has done more to question my beliefs, because as somebody who's in the business of trying to create more economic growth, and if you want my report card just to be that 0.3%, then you could put a big fat F. But having tried to use the powers that we have, I appreciate what is required. But again, I look at other small countries, and what do? Well, they don't try and be great at everything. They pick their strengths, and they're absolutely focused on what those strengths are. And they position themselves in relation to other countries as the place to do whatever it is. And I think that would be where Scotland has very clear and obvious strengths. And I think all of us can be in the business of celebrating Scotland's economy, whether it is energy, whether it's food and drink. Some of the tech startup and scale-up figures that we're seeing increasingly from independent sources, Scotland is completely outperforming its closest rivals, completely outperforming the rest of the UK. Sweden, which has long been seen as the source of great unicorns, outperforming that. So there's that's based on a background of innovation, research, entrepreneurial thinking, drive, determination. And so there's great strengths, and it's about backing them to the hilt.
Okay, Fraser, what would your view be the arguments for the union that make the best case, and what are the weakest case? And where might you rethink your argument? Could you ever imagine rethinking your position?
Well, it's funny listening. I actually think that Kate's strongest case is actually her weakest one. Insofar as you say, but let's look at your premise. I completely agree with. Like, if Scotland can do X, Y, and Z better, like if devolution, for example, had made schools significantly better, if it had made hospitals better, if public services had significantly better than England's because they were run in Scotland, I might rethink. If I think, you know what, maybe this home rule thing was correct. Why not give control over defence and foreign affairs and just do a whole? I would be completely open to that if the last 25 years had not been as they have been. Now, if you're kind of, when you look at the House situation, you look at this debacle of whether it's the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Govan, whether it's seeing our education go from being one of the best in the OECD to being middling, to being even worse in England, it's unthinkable Scotland's had the lead over England educationally for centuries until fairly recently. This is kind of quite really depressing to see. And this is not a great advert for things being run better if they're run from Edinburgh. Now, if that were the case, I would change my mind, but it's difficult to look at the health record, look at the drugs deaths crisis as the worst in Europe. And these are things that have got significantly worse over the last 10 to 15 years. And so that's where I would, as somebody who likes to think of myself as evidence-based, would change my mind if those indicators had gone the other way. But my main case about it is basically is that we are I believe that we of these islands are one people, and we've got way more in common with each other than we have differences. I don't see why we're so different to England that we'd have to sue from divorce, and I see this, I don't feel any less Scottish living in St Margaret's of Scotland in London than I did up here. When I was culture or something is so different that we somehow need an apparatus to separate us. I think there are big differences. I think when you look at social attitudes, there's more difference in approach to the world between the southeast and the southwest of England than there is between Scotland and England. We're actually we've got the same 2 languages, English, and number 2 is Polish. If you look at the EastEnders figures, they're broadly speaking, broadly comparable. Culturally, variety is a strength of our islands, but between the 2 peoples of his countries, I thought our commonality is such an asset that you shouldn't throw that away lightly. And then the other point is, do we want Brexit times 20, which separation would be, in my view? And we're looking at all the disruption that's caused, some relatively bureaucratic change. If we were to impose that along the border, what would the economic strategy be, and all the rest of it? So the upheaval, again, I'd be prepared to back the upheaval if I could see some significant gains. Now,
But you back Brexit, and have we seen many gains from those?
Oh, but I reluctantly backed Brexit. I'm a Europhile, and I really had hoped that the EU would give basically us back control over immigration, because I saw a formula for populism. I thought that, we're talking about everything that's changed since I've been a journalist for 30 years. Back in the 90s, when we did free movement, nobody envisaged the kind of immigration and border crossings that were happening right now. So border control seemed like an old-fashioned tool. At the time, it was, we don't need that, let's bring down the Berlin Wall, and nobody really moves around. Now it turns out that the world is on the move. Border controls are a very important, very useful tool, and your average voter was going to want border controls to protect the nation-state, which has got a cohesive function. Now, where Kate and I differ, I suppose, is what we describe as a nation. I would describe the UK, Kate might see Scotland as the nation. But I do believe that we needed those tools for the nation-state, and I think overall it has not led to the economic things, you're right, but I think that the tools to control your borders are very important. Now, I'm not a kind of little Englander. I've changed my mind from being a kind of like open borders guy into appreciating that my prejudices were fine for people like me, but it was the guys on the other end of the social spectrum that it was very difficult for. So I'd come to recognise that I was prescribing for the country something that worked very well for the middle class, and that you needed more tools. So I do think that the Brexit overall will be seen to be a good thing in getting us the tools that we need. Now, what you do with those tools, you're judged by. The Tories were crucified at the last election because they completely made a mess of it. Immigration surged, and all the responsibility was focused on them. Quite right too. No blaming the EU. But I think Brexit, for example, one of my predictions for this year is that the Labour government will control immigration. That there are some projections that it will even hit net zero by the end of this year. Now, if immigration is off the national topic, what does Nigel Farage talk about? Now, this is a lever we didn't have before Brexit. We've got it now. Brexit was never going to make Britain better or worse. It was just going to give you the potential to govern it better or govern it worse. And I think a country which is seen to by the people having control over the borders will have less of a need for populism. So, and now, I could be proved very wrong here. In 10 years' time, I could prove that Brexit actually paved the way for Farage and his liberal conservatism, or whatever you want to call it. But right now, I saw Brexit as being necessary to give centrist governments the powers to stave off populism.
Okay, if I can ask one last question on independence. If the SNP do win this election, what advice would you give your colleagues on how to achieve it? What's the strategy?
Yeah.
Should we press for an immediate second referendum?
Can I make 2 points of context just in response to Fraser around entity? So I do think most people in Scotland, irrespective of whether they support independence or not, would recognise Scotland as a country or as a nation. So the United Kingdom was always, by definition, the uniting of different nations. And I think most people would still accept that there is a distinction, for example, not that Fraser was making this point, but others would, a distinction between, say, a constituency in England and the nation of Scotland. And then I think, secondly, there is generally, as you have seen over the last few years in particular, there are often differences of opinion in terms of that entity. So Brexit being a really obvious one, but in terms of fixing some of the problems, immigration being another one, we have big challenges with lower immigration in some parts of Scotland where we actually need more people. Depopulation is one of the most under-discussed emergencies in our country right now. So I think those two areas, and that leads me to totally forget what you actually asked me.
So it was if the SNP win, what's the strategy? Should you try and play it along?
So I think the other part to this is around, so the SNP have obviously won every election since 2007. So despite criticism of varying different types, they're on track to once again be the biggest party by a country mile. And the party that won at a UK level 18 months ago is in third place and are hoping they hold on to third place. And that, I think, is very instructive in what I think the public are looking for as well. And I come back to the central point, and actually this is perhaps where I agree to an extent with Fraser. At a time where people need a cause for hope and that things are going to get better, there's plenty of evidence that this generation is one of the first generations that does not believe their prospects are going to improve. They believe their prospects are going to get worse. In other words, there is a hopelessness and a pessimism right now characterising a lot of the public debate. You need to give hope. And there's an electorate that have been disappointed by the last two parties they voted for at a Westminster level. The last social attitude survey demonstrated, I think it was over 70%, want to back a party that will really deliver for Scotland as an entity. And if you can demonstrate that you can do that and give hope, then I think you do start to see the figures significantly change.
Okay, I'm going to have one last question, and then I'm going to throw it open to you. And it is actually, I'm very grateful for you bringing the point around hope and pessimism in, because Fraser, I described you at the top as a rational optimist, which is your description, and you use data to back that up. So I wonder if you could give us, and back it up, the case for rational optimism at the moment, at a time when people are feeling rather hopeless, and as Kate says, a lot of young people feel that they're not going to be better off than their parents, and in fact, that may be the case.
Right, well, I would put my case for optimism quite simply, that if any of you could choose any time to be alive in Scotland, you couldn't choose what social strata, you can choose to be rich or poor, but you can choose a time. What time would you choose? What decade? What era? And I'd be amazed if, after a careful thought, any of you didn't choose right now. I mean, you wouldn't want to be around here. There's so many things I could talk about the crime rates, the health rates, the communication options, the travel options, the education, the position of women, the position of minorities. You know, it's very difficult to think that things were better really in any other decade. So if you think that, then there follows a kind of radical, intrusive thought, which is, this is the best time to be alive. Now that sounds heretical because it sounds like dismissing all the negative things. But then again, if not now, then when? So right now...
2007?
2007?
Before the crash.
Oh, before the crash? No, but the GDP was broadly speaking about 20% less. Disposable income was about 15% less. Violent crime was probably about twice what it is right now. I mean, there's so many things that I could tell you why 2007 was a materially worse place. And I could, by the way, I can argue with room-emptying conviction about any other year. So that's number one, right? Now, number two, it doesn't seem that way because as human beings, we're programmed to look at the threats around the corner. That's what we're here for. As a journalist, it's my job pretty much to find out what's going wrong. Where are the scandals? Nobody will think it's news that Mr. and Mrs. Smith are having a great, anniversary, etc. I mean, Kate started this by talking about how she's looking forward to being basically a mother to her daughter. That isn't particularly news compared to what else Kate's been up to in the last year. But, I can tell you what's going to make more difference in Kate's life. She's exactly right. To bring somebody into the world, to have the love of a family, that's incredible. But you never write about these things because they're not particularly interesting. What's going wrong is interesting, but it is less important. That's why Kate's making the switch which she is. Now, the other thing is that I've gotten the political, we're at a dead end right now because lots of politicians are stuck in old thinking. I think Scotland is absolutely ripe for a change where a new generation are going to bring new ideas. Populism is only big because the other guys haven't quite got with the agenda yet. I think that a lot of the things, when you look at them, are also stupid, that they're quite easy to come up with solutions. So I've got a feeling that the students here in this room will probably live through a kind of Scottish Renaissance. And who knows, by the time Scotland's at its peak, there might be a wonderful 55-year-old First Minister called Kate Forbes doing all this. Who knows what the future holds. But broadly speaking, if you ever feel like being pessimistic about life right now, think, what other decade, what other year would I like to be living in? And you'll find out on almost every level that would have been worse.
Are you similarly optimistic?
Well, I was going to do a
not just because you're leaving politics.
I was going to do a big wink and say Prime Minister, I think.
Oh, yeah. That'd be disaster, right?
So, after all that rational evidence, you're going to have to forgive my next line. But the darker it is, the brighter little lights shine. In other words, for everybody who has a point to make about what's going wrong, they probably have an idea and a solution. And if you go from ranting about it in a pub or in your living room to actually doing something about it, then you could absolutely change everything. And if a group of people decide to do that, it's even more impactful and you build it up. So I actually think that in light of that pessimistic outlook that I apologise for sharing, what we need is people that actually care. And somebody asked me 2 nights ago why more good people don't stand for politics. And actually it's a difficult question to answer because you can justify it on the basis of a whole host of different, high-level reasons. But at the end of the day, you just need more good people to step forward and stand in very different ways, either as politicians or as journalists or whatever it is, or in the civil service, and so on. But people are not, for reasons, let's ignore those reasons, so go for it. And I think that gives me great optimism that actually solutions are within grasp, and Fraser's absolutely right. The populists will win until everybody else gets their act together and says, I can do something different.
Brilliant. What a great message. Okay, we're going to go to questions. Robert at the back there has a microphone. Please do make a point as well as if you wish to make a question, but I would ask you to keep it brief, just out of respect for everybody else, so that we can get through as many as possible. So there's a gentleman who has his hand up right there, and you can make your first question a point.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate both of you being here tonight. Appreciate both of your words. Despite being both part of a binary debate that cuts through a lot for me. The first thing I just want to say is to Fraser Nelson. Fraser, unless I misheard you right there, you seem not to have mentioned the crippling inflation and increase in prices that affect everyone every day here in Scotland when you spoke about 2007. But I suppose for me, what both of you said is about sales, Fraser, and for you, Kate, authenticity. And Fraser and Kate, if Nigel Farage can sell his unique brand of right-wing politics, what do you think the current administration, Keir Starmer and the Labour government, can do to sell the Labour government in Scotland? To Scots, he seems to me, as a previous Labour voter, to be both ineffective and inauthentic. And as you say, Kate, growth is key, and growth is poor here, to put it mildly. I wondered personally about rejoining the single market as a seismic step that this current government could take. And debates about Brexit aside, I wondered if both of you think this would be helpful politically, and what the barriers might be UK-wide to this being an effective step.
Okay, I'm going to put that to Kate first. What advice do you have for the Labour government, for Keir Starmer, over the next couple of months?
So I think they came into government having squandered all the time in opposition without any real clear sense of what they wanted to change. And a lot of people are more disappointed because they had higher expectations than they would have been had they had low expectations and been disappointed. So I think for me, whatever it is, 14 U-turns, 15 U-turns, with each of those U-turns, they've squandered political capital and not got any of the benefit of the actual U part of the turn. So the farmers is a great one, where you had farmers that were absolutely gutted, worried, concerned. There was a minor U-turn, but it doesn't outdo the year or so of challenge. And the same with the winter fuel payment. They don't get the benefit of any bounce of a U-turn, but they lose out on it. So my strong view would be, if you go back to 2007 when the SNP came into office, they had a really clear sense of what they were going to do, and then they drove it basically absolutely robustly to get it done. Now, I'm not saying that there's not always imperfections with new governments coming in, but it's what do you actually want to do, and then just drive it. And there will be plenty of noise, but if you really believe that this is the thing to do, drive it.
And Fraser, the question that he was asking, the gentleman was asking as well, was about the question about the single market and whether we should actually, rethink Brexit, go for a softer Brexit.
Right. Well, first of all, you make a very good point about inflation, sir. Now, one of the ways that I try to look at this is try to look at what you can buy with the average wage. Now, in 2007, disposable income was inflation adjusted. It was lower than today, although not by much. What has happened is, since the great financial crisis that he says, we've had an unprecedented kind of stagnation, which was never been recorded in all the decades of economic history. So it will not feel like progress, and if it is, it won't be particularly much. It will, compared to what you can normally expect over like 19, 20 years. I guess if I've got my optimism hat back on, you wouldn't have had the iPhone in 2007. Is that a good or a bad thing? I don't know. You'd probably be a lot happier. On the common market, and again, if you look at our services exports to the EU, they're growing very, very fast. You could not see a dent, actually, for Brexit when the speed of our services exports. And we sell more services now as an economy than we do goods. So I don't think going back into it if we were to, and the other thing is, of course, if you go back into an organisation like that, you have to abide by various regulations. Now, one of the Brexit dividends is that we get to set our AI regulation separate to the EU. The EU has come up with very onerous AI regulation, which has pushed a lot of the startups and a lot of the IT work to Scotland, Glasgow, also to London and in Bristol. So I think that even though that's in its infancy now, over the next 5 to 10 years, the ability to diverge on regulation in the world's fastest growing sector is probably a plus, and I don't really see the going back into the single market would probably constrain us. I mean, again, as a Europhile, I really wish that the EU was not so regulatory of all its various sectors and talents. We seem to want ever tighter leash. And that's why I still think that we're better off out than probably the only person in this single room who thinks that. I accept it.
Can I get a question from a student, please? I don't know if there's any students in the room who'd like to ask a question. Yeah, I'm assuming you're a student. You look like one. You're wearing a tie, that's why I asked. But...
Thank you. Kate spoke a bit about how critical economic growth is to seeing off the threat of populism, sort of instability, apathy, voter apathy. How do we get growth? Because I think there's a lot of ground to cover still in convincing people that independence is the key to that kind of 2.3% growth and beyond. How do we actually get there? And if we are to pursue growth aggressively, as we seem to need to, what should we be prepared to sacrifice along the way? What will it cost to get that growth?
Thank you very much.
So, pretend, I'm not an economist, okay, so just to park that for a minute. Basically, to drive economic growth, we need to ensure that every business is growing, prospering, and that wages are good and growing, okay? How do we do that? Well, in Scotland, we have particular industrial strengths. Now, we know that there have been particular challenges affecting some of those key industrial assets in recent times, in recent months. A lot of that is to do with the disproportionately and uncompetitively high costs that they are dealing with. So that is eating into, it's hampering to the extent that some of them are failing completely. So there's one issue, dealing with some of the challenges. But secondly, and the one I wanted to spend a bit more time on, was around where our greatest opportunities for growth is. As I said, you don't want to be moderately good at everything. You want to be absolutely excellent at a few things. And we are already excellently good, high quality, high standard in particular industries. So energy being an obvious one. And the potential that we had, particularly around some of the energy transition. We had an early mover, first mover advantage in some of that transition. What has stalled that? What has meant that some of those that made hundreds of millions of pounds of investments up front in the supply chain are not getting their orders is because of regulation and bureaucracy that is getting in the way of that progress. So particularly in and around things like offshore wind, right now, where it is just taking far too long. Everything gets moved to the right, investors walk, and I think we're facing a huge challenge right now, which means that you're seeing jobs lost before new jobs are created. So absolutely investing in our strengths. I think I talked a little bit about some of the other strengths that we have. Universities, research, tech. As I said, Tech Nation report, absolutely tremendous in terms of where some of that growth is and then I talked earlier about some of the food and drink sectors as well. So there's three very random sectors plucked from relative thin air where we can excel. You know, food and drink exports UK-wide. What's the top two? Well, they're Scottish products and they're in huge demand. And despite whisky being affected by some of the issues in North America, the opportunities for South America, India, the growth there is huge. And each of those food and drink businesses that are growing, I was just at Prestwick Airport, I mean, the growth they've got in cargo, in freight alone for Scottish salmon is absolutely phenomenal in terms of the demand. So there's huge opportunities for growth, but you absolutely need to pursue it. Reduce costs where they are hampering growth. Invest in opportunity and absolutely back where you're strongest, rather than trying to be good at everything.
Okay, let's take another question from another student, if I may. Yeah, the lady right at the back over there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. 1 second, sorry. I'm trying to pull the notes up. Yeah, so I'll try and keep this as brief as I can. I've got a question for each speaker. First of all, for Kate Forbes, I wanted to run through some of the things that you've done under your electoral campaigns. So in 2021, you made £371 million of cuts to local authorities, including in localities which were already in the deep end in terms of healthcare provision. And you said earlier that you were somebody who's in the business of trying to create more economic growth, and it's clear to me, therefore, that the cost of your growth is the safety and health of these localities. And if there is pessimism in young people, as you say, then it's really no wonder, considering what they're growing up under. In your 2023 election campaign, you told Sky News that having children outside of marriage is wrong according to your faith in the Free Church of Scotland. And as much as I believe that in surviving politics there should be a separation of the church and state, you're more than welcome to your opinions. But I just find it interesting that religion-based views are allowed to impact social policy for a largely secular population. You also said that you only saw validity in marriage between women and men, but credit where credit's due, as much as you said you wouldn't vote for gay marriage, where it put forwards in 2014, were you voting, you wouldn't overrule it, so fair dues. But I also wanted to make a point that you said earlier, between your career in childcare, the important thing within that for you was proving that women can choose. And yet, at the beginning of your political career, you took payment from an anti-abortion group, which is an interesting thing in itself. You are also currently responsible for Scottish Enterprise, which is only divesting from trade with Israel where possible, despite the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And as much as this has become a somewhat convoluted background to this politics, I just want to ask, survival seems to be a luxury rather than a right, and when surviving politics, who have you allowed to survive? For Fraser Nelson, I wanted to speak about the Britain's Benefits Scandal documentary. So to begin with, there was somewhat a conflict of interest that made it more of an advertisement than a factual documentary for the Centre of Social Justice. And your assertion that nobody is noticing 3 million benefit claimants is completely untrue. There's a constant bashing in the media of disadvantaged peoples, and conversely, I think what's missing is that people aren't bringing humanity into these conversations. There's a lack of humanity in modern politics. And yes, there will be some fraud, undeniably, in claims, but to state you don't look disabled to people claiming PIP, I think is just absolutely egregious. And I'd like to point to the fact that when you put this forward in this way, who is your enemy? Is it, the people who are just trying to get life-saving disability benefits or choose between getting food for their children and paying the bills and are getting a wee bit of income from the government to do that? Or is it the, various high-stakes political figures who are in the Epstein files? Who is your enemy? You called the PIP application easy, and yet it's 40 pages long. You failed to mention COVID. And if this talk's called Surviving Politics, you've failed transparency in this way, and you've allowed your conflict of interest to mar your journalistic capabilities.
Okay, so can we just, there's an awful lot to get through there, so I'm going to just ask
I need
Fraser
to actually ask him the question I'm trying to put forward, if that's okay. You said more in common as part of your talks here. Whether unintentional or not, this was echoing Joe Cox. And yet your divisive nature in this documentary has in fact just served to, divide. So why do you use your platform to spread division from the top down? And in the same way you didn't speak about the cost of living crisis in your assertion that this is the best time to be alive, you failed to understand what it is to try and live. And I also forgot earlier, I was going to put to Kate Forbes, that you have stated a rapist cannot be a woman. And that was surrounding Isla Bryson, and to ignore the transphobia.
Could you possibly come to a question? It's just we're trying to get through an awful lot of questions from people.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. But if you say rapist can't be a woman, if you put forward all of these things about, taking money from an anti-abortion group, gay people shouldn't get married, but I wouldn't vote against it now. Surviving politics, authenticity is an important one, but I just find it very interesting that that's what we have in our modern field.
Can I just say, I think this would have been much more interesting if you guys had swapped places. So.
Sure, fair enough. Much better than me. Fraser, do you want to take first on the benefits issue that you've raised a lot of?
Yeah, God, there's so many questions there. Where do I go? About divisiveness, the real division that my documentary was aimed against is the division that we've got in our society that presents those in work from those out of work. It is I think, one of the biggest scandals in our country right now that we are discarding the talents and benefits of so many million people. That I think, I wish those figures were untrue, but there was 2.8 million people in out-of-work benefits in 2008. That figure is now 3.5 million. It's going to be 4 million at the end of this Parliament. That is a lot of people to be basically giving welfare checks and ditching on the end of society. I don't think that's compassion, one little bit. I think now the whole point of my documentary, if anybody wants to see it, by the way, it's I've got a Substack and it is there. That very much sets out, it's I think the most important thing which I want to try to do in journalism, which is try to explain the system from the perspective of those who use it. The enemy is the system. We've got good people caught in a bad system, very heavily penalised if they try to get back into work, and given every possible encouragement to go down a route when they stumble to keep them down. I think it's pernicious. I think there should be a lot more outrage over the system than there is. And it actually comes back to your point, sir, about what do we need for an economy. We need an economy that uses the talent of a lot more of its people than we're doing right now. We've got places in the Easter House in this city, and there are other places where 50% are on out-of-work benefits. Now, that is not what I would call a compassionate society. And sure, we can financially afford it? Yes. But morally, can we afford it? Not one little bit. And I would like us to get, I think, a lot more concerned about those people who are not in a room like this or wouldn't come anywhere near it, those who tend not to vote in elections, but those who are still our countrymen who we are systematically excluding from the economy in the name of compassion. And so I could go into the other points there, but if I can just answer one of Kate's points. I mean, you mentioned there about what Kate said about what your church believes about marriage and all the rest. Kate's church, as far as I can work out, takes the same position as pretty much every mainstream Muslim or Christian organizations. So are you saying that nobody who believes in any of these organizations should be allowed in public life? And Kate has not legislated according to what her church says. She's made very clear that she believes this personally, that she's liberal politically. No, I think, because right now, because Kate, my point here is, Kate takes these bullets because she actually says out loud what a lot of us who are religious don't have the courage to say out loud. So in this particular moment, I would like to say that not just me, but for Muslims, for Sikhs, for Hindus, for Christians of all denominations, we're amazed at the courage Kate had of saying that. And I would just want to put myself in the line of that particular book.
But I think the point the lady was making was that this, in a broadly secular society, the division between church and state, was it right to, Kate, and you can now answer the questions that she was put to you about the very controversy that you found yourself in?
Yeah. So I've got 2 points. The first is, I have so much admiration for you coming to ask these questions. Because you know what's missing in our politics is having the guts to come to an event like this and actually put the questions that you want to ask to a political leader that you fundamentally disagree with. And I think that if more people did what you've just done this evening, then our politics would be in a much happier place. Because the beauty of our politics is that it thrives on respectful disagreement. It thrives on, essentially, democracy being at least 2 people that have a difference of opinion, openly, transparently discussing it, and then coming to their own position. And the great danger of our politics, I think, in this day and age, is that people are too frightened to do that, so you push them to the margins, and then things get really ugly, because there isn't that openness of debate. And the second thing I wanted to say is that I took the view, and continue to take the view, that you could have 2 different types of politician. You could have a type of politician that thinks lots of different things, and then just says exactly what they think the electorate want to hear, and what will enable the press to give them the easiest time. You vote for them on false pretenses, because they're actually a fraud doing that. They get in, and then they do all sorts of stuff. And they actually have no mandate, because they didn't square with the population. And my view was that in a democracy, ultimately, the voter is right. But I have a duty to ensure that the voter knows who they are voting for. So in 2016, I was first elected. And all the stuff, all the questions that you heard in 2023, I was asked that in village halls. I openly talked about it, it's just that nobody had heard of me. So it was only my local population that asked these questions and voted. And they voted for me with an increased share of the vote. I then had 5 years as their representative, where every Friday I sat in a village hall and anybody could come in and ask me any question, could come with their constituency issues and so on. And in 2021, which was my first report card on my first 5 years, I got the biggest majority in Scotland. And I think that what the public deserve the respect of politicians to answer questions openly and then say, it's up to you how you want to vote, which is why I completely stand by the outcome of the leadership contest, because I stand by the openness that I wanted to display and then the result of the voters. But the other thing that struck me, and I may be emphasising polls a bit too much this evening, but I do find them fascinating. Throughout that leadership contest, I remained the favourite in terms of the public's opinion. And when it all finished, cannot tell you the stack of correspondence I had, which was, we have been craving politicians who actually answer questions. I fundamentally disagree with you on all these points, but we are craving that authenticity of answering questions. And then the rest is up to the electorate, and that is the beauty of democracy.
But we've talked this evening about the importance of evidence and, data, evidence in order to backup policy. So where in the world of evidence should faith have a role? Why should it have a role?
We talk a lot about, politicians being able to be themselves. We live in a representative democracy. We want people. We want a diverse parliament, okay? And there are people of faith in this country. And I think they should see their parliament reflect them. And one of the things I found the most difficult at the beginning of the leadership contest was the assumption that some people are automatically excluded by virtue of a characteristic. Faith is a protected characteristic. And so the idea that you would automatically exclude people of faith from your public square just by virtue of that point flies completely in the face of liberal democracy.
Can I just go back to that lady just to make sure you asked a lot of questions? Just very briefly, is there anything there that you didn't feel was addressed? Just go back with the microphone, sorry. Just very briefly, were there any issues?
Sexuality is also a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, just as religion is. If there's freedom of religion, there must be freedom of sexuality. And you didn't address the 371 million cuts to local authorities, nor the genocide in Gaza.
Cuts.
Yeah. Well, I think the figures speak for themselves. So we've got health spending at record levels. So the Scottish Government budget is between 55 and 60 billion, give or take. Health spending, it's about £23 billion. It's a huge percentage of the overall pot available. And so, every year that I presented a budget, the health spend increased in every single year.
Okay. Right. Another question. Yes. I'm sorry. Sorry, Robert.
Short but sweet question. With Plaid Cymru rising in polls in Wales and Sinn Féin returning a First Minister in Northern Ireland and the SNP expected to win a near majority, is the union organically disintegrating before our eyes?
Okay. Fraser.
I don't think so. I don't think there's much appetite in Scotland to have a second referendum. I could be wrong there. I was wrong-footed the last time this came around. I think the union's actually pretty robust. I think it's been through lots of tests and strains in the last few years. And I actually think that the more unpredictable the wider world is, the more sense it makes for the rest of us to club together.
Okay, Kate.
Yes.
I wonder if anybody would have, again, any students are interested in the issues we were talking about getting involved in politics. Are there any students here who are thinking about maybe getting involved in public life and politics who would like to ask a question? Yeah, chap right at the back.
Hi there. I'm here with the Glasgow Guardian, actually, so it's great to see a former editor, yourself here, Fraser. I don't specifically want to get involved in politics, but I'm quite interested in journalism. So my question is for Kate Forbes. I know so many people in fourth year are now looking for jobs, and I just want to know, what is it that the Scottish Government is doing for students that are graduating to really make it easier for graduates to enter the job market? I feel like, speaking to my peers, there's a feeling of hopelessness at the minute. And real concerns over how AI is influencing in hiring processes. So yeah, what is it that you are doing in your position as Deputy First Minister? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that while AI will have a big impact on some jobs, it creates way more opportunities in other areas, particularly those with some of the skills that AI can just never replace. Particularly some of the social and emotional skills, and even though AI is developing at a hugely rapid pace, I think that is still the case. In terms of what we're doing, I've changed the approach that we're taking to skills in the last year. So to have worked with essentially clusters of businesses in different sectors to ensure that they have a really granular understanding of the skills that they need over the next 30 years. So we've done that on let's take one example, the Clyde. So with maritime skills, this is just one random example. For ages I've heard businesses say, oh, we need skills. But actually they don't come forward with precisely, well, how many people do you need and in what sectors and with what skill sets? So we've given them a little bit of money to develop a really granular understanding of what they need, and then to work with universities and colleges to be able to deliver in those areas. We've done that in the Highlands and Islands, where we've done an entire region, granular level data. Easier to do in the Highlands and Islands than it will ever be in Glasgow, which is why you do the sectoral approach. And just today, over in Prestwick, looking at the development of the aerospace sector, again, trying to have a really clear understanding of what they're doing. So in terms of what your peers are looking for, I'm trying to help organise these business clusters, as it were, to have greater understanding themselves as a group of what they need, and then to work with the colleges and universities to secure those jobs. So I can't point you to a website or something like that, but these guys should have a greater understanding, so it probably does depend. I don't think I've done that for journalism quite yet.
Fraser, on journalism, do you think actually we might be seeing a bit of a renaissance? Do you go back to your optimistic case in the sense that there's a premium now on information, on good information?
There is, and also there are so many tools. I think now is probably the best time to be a journalist. There are so many tools at your disposal. There are so many ways of telling stories, so many avenues that are opening to prize open subjects that were completely closed before. There's so much you can say now about science. I mean, AI gives the journalist so many more tools to be able to, look at all this, what we've discovered from Mendelssohn in the last, appalling, right? But it's far greater that we can see that. Previously, we wouldn't have had tools to see this kind of stuff. So I think that right now, newspapers are in a difficult way. But the information market is big and is growing. And I think the more nonsense that there is in social media of this pantomime disagreement, the more appetite there will be of people trying to learn and understand. So I think I'm very bullish on the prospects for journalism. So you're in the right place.
Okay, I think it's nearly 8 o'clock, so we've got time for a couple more. So I'm going to ask this chap right at the front.
My question is for Kate Forbes, and as someone who's just moved to Glasgow within the past half a year, and as someone who is quite heavily right-wing, I feel like I have been silenced in some sort. So I was wondering, does the SNP feel like they have destroyed freedom of speech in Scotland at all?
Absolutely not, because I'm standing here getting asked a few uncomfortable questions and answering them in front of you. So I think that we have these great privileges, these great freedoms, which we probably still don't appreciate and might appreciate more if we went to a lot of other countries in terms of freedom of speech. And it is your right to use that freedom and to share your views in a respectful way. You know, it does help if it is respectful. But the fact you're here asking a question would suggest to me that you've not been silenced and you have just as much a right as anybody else to share your views. And like I said to the previous questioner, it's far more healthy to have that open debate than to push those views into the fringes, because I think views without challenge become dangerous. So you being able to open your mouth, share your view and receive challenge is much healthier for debate.
Fraser, the J.D. Vance has said that the freedom of speech issue is worse than a bigger threat to Europe than Ukraine. Where do you stand on this?
I think that is, look, there are some important free speech issues, but I think J.D. Vance, I think he was claiming that in Scotland you can get arrested if you're praying inside a house next to an abortion clinic. Some deranged stuff like that. I don't think that's true. It's not true, Kate, is it?
There are buffer zones, but you can obviously pray.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are buffer zones in England too, right? There are buffer zones all right round the world. Now, I think there's... now, I've actually changed my mind on buffer zones. I used to be against them. I used to think that, obviously, I take my church's position. I'm generally anti-abortion. But I actually live on a street next to an abortion clinic and pass it every day. And quite often I see women getting out and going into that clinic. And the point is, it became clear to me that was probably the worst day of that woman's life. And what really, the guys at the end chanting with the placards, making it a little bit worse, it wasn't achieving anything. Even if you take my kind of view over it, all you were doing is you're not going to change your mind on that thing. And so I came to believe that if we're going to rub up against each other, we need to give each other space. As a Catholic, I would request that the state doesn't, mind if my church doesn't have women priests and all the other things which I know are against the kind of the equality laws. But if we give churches space, in my view, religious people should also create space, like we should stay away from the abortion clinics. I think right now, and also I think Britain is on the brink of becoming an incredibly successful multi-faith society, rather than a secular society. And I think we do that by just recognizing that if we are going to rub up together, then we try not to antagonize each other. And to me, the protesters outside the abortion clinic were antagonistic and were inappropriate. I don't think it's a massive threat to free speech to say, let's have a zone now where women can get out of that taxi and go into the abortion clinic in privacy and safety. I don't think that's taking away anybody's ability to protest against it. So I actually think that the reason that J.D. Vance is so annoyed about it is because we're pulling off something in this country which should be against everything which MAGA believes in. We are a successful, multi-faith, multi-racial society. We are getting along together. Sure, we've got our tensions and cross points, but we're getting along together in this country pretty much better than almost any other country in Europe. So when I look at Britain, I see the successes there against the odd successes, which certainly go against the MAGA Britain's in flames because there's a race riots and stuff. No, I don't see that. I see at the King's coronation, my wife was pointing out, she's a Swede, and she was saying, look, you see a bunch of guys going through a ceremony, but I see a Hindu Prime Minister reading from the Bible with his Indian wife, with a Muslim Scottish First Minister, with a Muslim Mayor of London, with a Hindu providing Home Secretary. In no other country in the world is that kind of scene imaginable. And that's what we have sort of accidentally created in this country. I think it's very precious, and that we keep it by giving each other space. And I think the free speech canard is often given to try to pursue some kind of hardline, antagonistic approach, going after other people. And I think we have chosen that we're naturally getting towards a more cohesive, more successful way.
Thank you. Right, who would like the last question of the evening? The chap just there, please.
Very appreciated for sharing ideas tonight. So I have questions, might be a little bit offending, but a little bit practical, and I have three questions. First question is for Ms. Kat Forbes, and the second two is for Mr. Fraser Nelson. So the first question is, I try to make it much more simplified, not waste time of the audiences and both of you guys. So it seems like in recent years, Britain is experiencing a continuous and unstoppable fiasco of infrastructure and manufacturing industries, and especially for Scotland. So for new companies, it seems like Keir Starmer companies try to switch attitude for this kind of regions, like promoting or keeping forward the HS2 program, and in the program of the renationalize the railway company in England. But it seems like the tension between Westminster Number 10 and Holyrood is still continuous, just as in Grand Chimos and in other public programs like the spaceport in Orkney and the other parts of Highlands. So do you think that when the Labour Party government is switching the economic and industrial policies to a much more tough and much more, I don't want to use the word like the back to the era before Thatcher. I don't want to use that kind of words. They try to changing the direction about the industrial and public policies into a much more practical, much more state-owned direction. Do you think in such kind of backgrounds that the tension between Edinburgh and London will be rising? Or
okay. Over to you, Kate.
In terms of the tensions, I think they're separate to that question. I think there's already quite a big difference between Scotland and England in terms of that question of nationalisation. So, for example, Scottish Water is already essentially nationalised compared with water utilities down south. There's obviously a difference too in terms of railways. So, actually, in situations like that, I always think, lack of conflict and unity never makes the news. And on areas like railways, actually, there's been a lot of really good collaboration on it. When it comes to British Steel, we would have liked to have seen more support for key assets, strategic assets in Scotland, particularly around Grangemouth, which we were disappointed about. So that is where there is a source of tension. But I think that generally the tension comes from areas around whether or not we feel that the UK government are acting in Scotland's best interests, rather than on an ideological point around nationalising utilities, if I've understood you correctly.
Okay. It is 8 o'clock, and that means I'm going to have to release you all. We've talked a lot about policy tonight, in fact, more than I was expecting, but I guess that's the case when you bring a serving government minister to the university. But I'm going to end just by thinking about a couple of things from both of our guests. I think from Fraser's, I'm taking this case for rational optimism in a liberal country that you've, I think, set out tonight in a very kind of persuasive way, and I hope people take that away, as I have done as well, that it is a case for optimism, and I think you've given us the evidence for that. And then from Kate, the thing I take away was your point about if you really want to make a difference, get involved, do something. We're not just observers. We can make a difference by choosing to act, and that is the best response, I think, as you were saying, Kate, to populism and to the forces that might be driving us apart. So that's what I take from the two of you. You'll have your own things that you'll take away. I hope you've really enjoyed listening to both our speakers this evening. And on your behalf, I just want to thank them very much for the time they've given. They've travelled a long distance here this evening. So please do give them a big round of applause for the time they've given to this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.